Of objects in the Islamic world. It's generally associated with the lives led by princes and the pastimes of the elite. The striking design of this falconer on horseback, embellished with various colours, gives us a precious insight into the appearance of manuscript painting in the late 12th and early 13th centuries in Iran, since very few of these manuscripts have survived.
This dish was made in Syria in the 12th century. It was apparently discovered in the rubble of a house in the Aleppo region of northern Syria. Scientific researcher Karine Jouvin.
The decoration of this dish, with its straight, outward-sloping walls, shows a walking hare in the centre of the composition, surrounded by scrolls and knotted plant stems ending in parmet or half-parmet motifs. The dynamic pose of the animal's legs, the way its large ears stand on end, and the swirling movement of the plant motifs all help to create a lively, dynamic image. The dish illustrates the very widespread popularity of animal images at the time when it was made. There are many surviving examples of works featuring animals, such as lions, birds or hares, as we see here. These include a number of manuscript paintings illustrating the fables of Kalila and Dimna. Originally of Indian origin, the fables were a collection of moral tales based on animal characters that were very popular during the 12th to 13th centuries.
The stories of Kalila and Dimna were also one of the sources of inspiration for Jean de La Fontaine when he wrote his fables in the 17th century.
This object in the shape of a lion is a waterspout. Scientific researcher Claire Dellery.
This small lion in moulded bronze is an extremely expressive piece. Its prominent mouth is wide open, whilst the curve of its spine and the way the lion rests on its rear feet shifts its position forwards, giving you the impression it's about to roar. And this was probably expressed through a gush of water coming out of its mouth. A large hole under the animal's stomach would once have been linked to a vertical pipe channeling water into the animal's body and allowing it to spurt out through its mouth. At the opposite end, overall balance is provided by the lion's tail, which is as long as its body and stands upright. The tail is jointed, so it can be raised or lowered, but it doesn't activate any mechanism to shut off the flow of water. The articulated tail is only of decorative or symbolic value. We know of several very fine waterspouts in the shape of animals that decorated the Caliph's palace in Cordoba in the second half of the 10th century. This was a tradition imported from the east into Al-Andalus, the area of modern-day Spain that was under Islamic rule at that time.
The example was discovered in the province of Palencia in northern Spain in around 1865.
We also know of other examples of waterspouts in the form of a lion. One of them, which is now part of the collections at the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, shares many similarities with this piece. The fact that we find similar waterspouts in Spain and Cairo demonstrates the extent to which aesthetic models circulated from one side of the Islamic world to the other.
This wooden fragment of an arch was carved in Egypt in the 12th century. Scientific researcher Karine Jouvin.
The decoration is dominated by a network of curled plant stems, punctuated by parmets and pointed half-parmet motifs, as well as a geometric pattern towards the top. As you can see, the plant motifs and geometric design have been carved in high relief and stand out powerfully against the hollowed-out background of the wood panel. The complexity of the design is very typical of the wood carving that developed in Egypt in the 11th and 12th centuries, and we have many examples of decorative architectural elements created using this technique. These include mosque doors and friezes, as well as mihrabs, the niches that indicate the direction of prayer in a mosque.
But this piece wasn't carved for a Muslim religious building. If you look to the top left, you'll see a cartouche containing a partially damaged inscription, in which you might be surprised to see Hebrew characters.
This inscription contains a prayer offered up to God. The text expresses the desire to see, his altar and the construction of his sanctuary and his portico in the near future. Amen. This is a reference to the end of the world and the day of resurrection, when the Temple of Jerusalem would be rebuilt. So this inscription clearly suggests a Jewish context, indicating that the fragment may have been part of a synagogue in Cairo. With its Hebrew inscription, this arch illustrates the presence of a significant Jewish community in Fatimid Egypt, especially in Cairo. The Fatimids, who ruled Egypt between 969 and 1171 AD, were themselves a minority because they were Shiite Muslims, whereas the population was mainly Sunni. This was the reason for a certain level of tolerance of the Christian and Jewish minorities amongst the Fatimids, who used these minorities to help support their rule, as well as bringing certain members of these communities into their administration.
We also know examples of decorative woodwork that were created for churches. At this time, a significant proportion of the craftsmen were Christians and could equally find themselves working on churches, mosques, or palaces.
Scientific researcher Claire Dellery.
These sculpted hexagons are panels that used to decorate the minbar in the Great Mosque of Marrakesh. A minbar is a pulpit from which the imam preaches at Friday prayers and commemorates the sermons that the Prophet Muhammad gave from a raised platform. The minbar in question is a large structure in the form of a 9-step staircase, around 3.8 metres or 12.5 feet tall. It was mounted on wheels, so that on Fridays it could be placed next to the mihrab, a niche set into the wall, to indicate the direction of Mecca, which the congregation face as they pray.
These hexagonal panels came from the sides of the staircase that were part of a more complex decoration, also including 8 and 6 pointed stars. The very delicate plant motif carved into the hard wood is made up of asymmetric scrolls, palmettos, and pine cones.
The inscriptions decorating the minbar state that it was begun in 1137 in the Spanish city of Córdoba. It was probably transported in separate pieces for the journey of over 800 kilometres to Marrakesh and assembled in situ. Marrakesh, which at that point had existed for less than 100 years, was the capital of a great empire that included modern-day Morocco and the whole of the south of Spain. Initially, the city was just a tent camp, alongside a fortress and a great mosque, which were permanent constructions.
The emir of this great empire, Ali ibn Yusuf, commissioned the minbar for this first mosque. It was subsequently moved to Kutubia, which is now the city's best-known mosque. The minbar is still in Marrakesh, where it's on display at the El Badi Palace.
Ali ibn Yusuf, who was brought up in Spain, was clearly familiar with the minbar of the great mosque in Córdoba, with its inlaid decoration dating from the mid-10th century. He was an admirer of Spanish craftsmanship and so commissioned a new minbar from the Cordoban workshops for the mosque of his new capital. This import from Spain had a decisive influence on art in the Maghreb in later periods.
So in effect, the Muslim rulers who occupied Spain commissioned objects from the Andalusian craftsmen to decorate their new capital, and even brought them to Morocco to adorn their mosques. This candlestick was made by a great master metalworker, Dawood ibn Salama, whose famous Alhambra vase is also on display at the Louvre Museum. This piece was made in Syria, probably in Damascus, in around 1248 to 1249. Curator Sophie Macariou.
Il présente une iconographie qui mérite que l'on...
The iconography is worthy of our attention because, quite surprisingly, in an Islamic context, some of the themes are drawn from Christian iconography. The body of the candlestick is divided into 3 main sections. The 2 bands at the top and the lower section contain small figures, possibly figures of saints, inside medallion-like shapes reminiscent of archways. Then, in the main register of the decoration, in the centre, there are large medallions in which you can see scenes clearly taken from the New Testament. These alternate with very small medallions containing clearly secular iconography, featuring human figures and animals. But when you look at the medallions in the main field, you're struck by the differences between these images and their Christian models. One of the medallions, for instance, could be interpreted as a scene of the presentation of the infant Jesus at the temple. We see a child in his mother's arms, without a halo in this instance, being presented to a figure who must be the high priest. But usually in Christian iconography, there's always a sort of altar table between the two figures. So you can tell here that the artist had seen Christian models and was perhaps a Christian himself, or possibly Jewish. His name, which could be translated as David, son of Solomon, could perhaps support this second theory. He also used Eastern Christian sources for the iconography. We know of numerous examples of these images in manuscripts made for Syria's Christian community.
Given his free interpretation of these models, however, we can't deduce that the person who commissioned this candlestick was a Christian.